I want to reach back in my archives today and share a guest who is very special. He's no longer with us, but he's a clear thinker. But before I get into his clear thinking, I want to share an example of not thinking. In fact, I'd like to share an example of a worm crawling, because that's all I could think of as a title for this episode. Even though I have this fantastic guest from my archives, 2 of his appearances I'm going to share, but I still was thinking about the idea of a worm crawling, not because of the guest who is coming up, but because of the story I'm going to share quickly right now. I made a comment on X about the deep state, which is what we as Americans call the bureaucratic state, the people that have jobs that go on and on and on working for the government. And they generally, as I will explain in a second, they generally vote one way. In fact, they don't generally vote one way. They vote one way. They vote to the left. So I mentioned the deep state on X, not too terribly a controversial opinion. And this guy says, I don't believe in that. It's a conspiracy theory. I've been reading fill in the blank of autobiography from former German leader, and he says the same thing. Well, isn't that special, Captain Moron? Let me give a little more information about the deep state. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area in the United States of America. This is Washington, D.C., surrounded by the state of Maryland and surrounded by the state of Virginia. They call it the DMV, District, Maryland, Virginia. Maryland has always voted to the left. D.C. has always voted to the left. Virginia used to vote somewhat to the right, but now votes to the left as well. The area surrounding Washington, D.C. encompasses 6 to 7 of the wealthiest counties in the United States of America. They all vote blue. They all vote left by overwhelming margins. Overwhelming. Every fucking year. They all live in houses that cost millions of dollars. And until recently, let's say the last week, as Trump and Elon have ripped apart the deep state, we now know how all these people that live in the area where I grew up, how they get paid. They get paid through my tax dollars. So I get taxed. It goes to a slush fund called the USAID, US aid, ostensibly for foreign aid. But as we're finding out, it's a jobs program. And it's an extreme left-wing jobs program. Transgender in Colombia, transgender in Peru, all kinds of insane shit. This is the deep state. The one-party deep state that surrounds Washington, D.C. and gets themselves rich. Because all this, quote, aid money doesn't go to aid anybody except the people, the white-collar class, that get their jobs. Now, everything I've said so far is data. It's not my opinion. Go look up the data. Go look up who worked at USAID. Go look up the voting habits of the people that surround Washington, D.C., including Washington, D.C. Go look up the home value growth over the last 30 years. This is data, kids. It's not a political opinion. No one gives a shit about your political opinion. These are just facts. Now, if the left has been so powerful that they could assume these positions and could produce this self-dealing that enables them to have these high-paying jobs, hey, what do they say? It's all fair in love and war? So the left has been winning. The deep state has been winning for decades. Perhaps you can argue all the way back to the fall of the Soviet Union. But then all of a sudden, Elon and his merry band of autists, very smart autistic dudes, probably with 200 IQs, have ripped apart the system to expose what it is. So here we are now, looking at data, just data. You can like the data, you can not like the data, but the data is the data. And the data is the deep state. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just a large group of people that control the bureaucracy of the United States of America. And that large group of people have figured out a way to stay permanently embedded in the system and make themselves filthy fucking rich for decades. So when you hear somebody referring to the deep state as a conspiracy, don't argue with them. Like I told this guy, I don't care what he believes. He's a moron. He's an idiot. He's a fool. He's not even an American. So he has no idea what he's talking about. He watches CNN, he watches BBC, and that's it. Now, you might be sitting out there right now with left-wing views, and perhaps you like Mike Covel. Perhaps you like my trend-following books. But guess what? I'm not going to sit here and lie. I'm not going to sit here and make up stories to appease you because you happen to be on the left. I'm going to tell the truth. And the truth is, there is a deep state. The truth is, it's one party, and they get filthy rich from maintaining this bureaucratic state. Now, with all that said, with all my piss and vinegar out of the way, let me slide you into two relatively calm but inspirational views from an economist. As I said at the beginning, an economist no longer with us, one whose name is Walter Williams. I hope you enjoy this back-to-back archival episode 1 and 2.
Today on the show, I have Dr. Walter Williams. He's an American economist, commentator, academic. He is the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University, my alma mater. Syndicated columnist, author, very well known for his libertarian views. And even if that doesn't ring a bell, his voice will. A regular on AM radio over the last decade. Fantastic voice, very clear-minded. I love his thinking. He gets to the heart of libertarian economics like not many do. I'm fortunate to have him on. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Hey, listen, here's where I want to start with something kind of fun. I'm jealous. I'm envious. I want to intellectually steal something from you, and it's what you describe yourself as. And I just love this. You call yourself a radical. It's not fair. That's not fair for you to do that first. I love it.
Okay.
Why do you call yourself a radical?
Well, because my vision's part company with most people. Most people believe that one person should be forcibly used to serve the purposes of another. And so, and that includes a welfare stance, business bailouts, and all this kind of stuff. And I disagree with that position.
So let me jump into something specific, the morality of markets. A lot of people that don't understand markets and the benefits of markets often get upset when they contemplate the idea that there's a loser. But there's often a zero-sum nature of markets. And how do people get so confused on how markets can be a negative thing? Good, fair, honest markets. I'm not talking about crony capitalism or bailouts of banks, but good, honest markets. How can there be something bad about that?
Well, I think people don't understand, and they've been miseducated, and they've been subject to a lot of propaganda. Now, when I talk about the morality of markets, or when I make the case for the morality of markets, I don't start off talking about markets. I make the assumption that I, Walter Williams, am my property. I belong to myself, and you belong to yourself. And so when you start off with the basic assumption that each of us owns ourselves, then certain acts are immoral and other acts are moral. For example, the reason why murder is immoral is because it violates private property rights. Rape is immoral. It violates private property rights. And so is theft. Theft is immoral because it violates private property rights. Now, a free market, the system of a free market or institution of a free market, acknowledges the fact that people own themselves. Now, so if I own myself, then I have the right to engage in peaceable, voluntary exchange with anyone else. That is, if I want to buy tomatoes from you, then it's my business and it's your business, and it's no right of a third party to come in and say, well, no, we're going to cancel that exchange, or we think that it's better that Walter Williams buys tomatoes from an American producer. And so I think that the basis for arguing for a free market lies in the moral philosophy that was spoken about by John Locke centuries ago. You know, that the idea of self-ownership, and self-ownership means just many things. That is, self-ownership means that you cannot be forced to serve the purposes of somebody else. And this is what government welfare programs are, or government bailout programs. They're forcing one person to serve the purposes of another. Now, forcing one person to serve the purposes of another, that's a working definition for slavery. Mm. That is because slavery forces one person to serve the purposes of another, forcibly uses them. And so does the welfare state. It forcibly, the money, in other words, the money that government uses for food stamps, bailouts, it doesn't come from the Tooth Fairy. It doesn't come from Santa Claus. The only way that government can give one American citizen $1, or any citizen anywhere, money, but give one American, since I'm talking about America, to give one American $1, it must forcibly take that $1 from somebody else. That is some other American. That is, government cannot give one American citizen $1 without first taking that $1 from some other American. And so when you take that $1 from some other American, you are forcing him to serve the purpose of somebody else.
Very clear. And I know you're one of your maybe if not your largest motivation is as an educator to teach. But I think it would be good for my audience. I know many of my audience are going to be familiar with you, but born 1936, Philadelphia. And I've seen you describe yourself, your family, to say, we were poor, but we didn't think that way. And that's such a brilliant piece of advice. Even if it was just a description of your situation, it's still brilliant advice. Why don't you talk about the idea that you didn't think you were poor? You didn't think poor.
Well, my mother used to say, she used to tell us that we have a beer pocketbook, but we have champagne taste. And that is, matter of fact, I'm born in 1936, and back then, if you called somebody poor, that was an insult, because we didn't think of ourselves as poor people. We thought of ourselves as struggling people trying to do better. And matter of fact, the values at that time were much different from the values today, and particularly among black people. That is, we did not have the welfare mentality. We did not buy into the welfare state. Some of the pathology that you see today was completely absent in the 30s and 40s when I was in the 50s when I was growing up. And when I talk about particular pathology, the high illegitimacy rate among black Americans of over 70%, I think it's close to 75%. Well, back in the 1940s, it was like 12 or 13%. And or the breakup of the family. And matter of fact, back in the 1870s, 70-some% of black kids lived in two-parent families, compared to today, when somewhere around only 30% of black kids live in two-parent families, and in some cities, such as New York City, it's far less than that. And so, I think that when we were coming up, there was a different attitude. There was pride. I mean, to tell somebody, the one way to insult your friend is to say your mother's on relief, and that was that's what we called welfare back then. And to be on relief was an insult. And matter of fact, my stepfather used to always tell me that any kind of job is better than begging and stealing. Now, that's not the attitude for people today. A lot of people say, "Look, I'm not going to work at McDonald's for $7 something an hour. I'd much rather be on welfare. I'd much rather be begging for money."
In fact, you bring up working at McDonald's, and I'd like for you to go into your description, your explanation about the idea of minimum wage. And I think for a lot of people, they hear about minimum wage and maybe they have some money or they have some success. And the idea of minimum wage it sounds noble. It sounds beneficial to those that don't have. However, I think there's something more nefarious about minimum wage. And I'd like for you to expand on that.
Well, I think that most people support the minimum wage out of good intentions. They want their fellow man to have a higher wage, to be better off. And that's a fairly decent motivation. But when one has policy, when one forms public policy, he shouldn't pay attention to the intentions behind the public policy. He should ask, what is the effect of public policy? What is the effect of the minimum wage? And you see the effect of the minimum wage if you put yourself in the place of an employer, and you must pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire. And actually, $7.25 an hour is not your minimum cost, because you have to pay mandated benefits such as Social Security, unemployment compensation, and other fringes. But let's stick with $7.25, the current minimum wage in the United States. Now, if you must pay $7.25 an hour to no matter whom you hire, will you hire that worker who is so unfortunate so as to have skills that will only enable him to produce $4 worth of value per hour? In other words, would you pay somebody $7.25 when that somebody can only produce $4 worth of value? Well, most employers would look at that as a losing economic proposition. So they just would not hire such a person. And who are these people? Well, it's a low-skilled worker. The minimum wage law, one of the first effects of the minimum wage law is to discriminate against the employment of low-skilled workers. And it turns out in most economies, the lowest skilled workers are teenagers. They have low skills because they lack the experience and work attitudes and other attributes of adults. And among that number are black teenagers who not only share the handicaps of teenagers in general, but they share the additional handicaps of going to rotten schools, very often living in broken families and pathological neighborhoods. And so if you are predicting who would the greater unemployment effects of the minimum wage law, you would say, well, gee, it would have a devastating impact on the employment opportunities for teenagers, and doubly so on minority teenagers. And if you look at the empirical data, that's what it shows. One thing that people don't know, I did a study called Youth and Minority Unemployment for the Joint Economic Committee of Congress in 1976 or 78, somewhere around there. And in 1948, black teenage unemployment was 9.4%. White teenage unemployment was 10.2%. Compared to today, white teenage unemployment is around 20-some%, and black teenage unemployment is over 40%. And the labor force participation rates of blacks were greater during the 40s and 50s than whites. That is, labor force participation means that blacks were more active in the labor market than were white teenagers. And today, it's entirely the opposite. Now, there's one other thing about the minimum wage law that people don't understand. It destroys employment opportunities. Again, when I was a kid, when you pull into a gasoline station, there was a youngster to wash your windows, check the air in your tire, and maybe check your hood. Now today they're self-service stations, and they're not self-service stations today because Americans love to smell gasoline fumes while they're gassing up the cars. Or another example of a job disappeared when I was a youngster. There were in movie theaters that had ushers to show you to your seat. Today, there are no ushers in movie theaters, and it's not because Americans that they like to stumble down the aisles in the dark to find their seat. And just one other effect of the minimum wage, other than destroying jobs and causing premature automation, minimum wages are one of the most effective tools in the arsenal of racists everywhere around the world. In 1989, I wrote a book called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. So I did a study of labor markets in South Africa, and I found that, and I give many, many quotes in the book, of racist labor unions, South Africa racist labor unions, that would never have a black as a member, were the major supporters of minimum wage laws for blacks. And their stated reason was to make the wages so high for blacks that they would not be hired. And you see the motivation, that is, companies would hire a laborer, and they had to pay a white guy. I think this is like 1980 statistics. They might have to pay a white worker $3 an hour, but they get away hiring a black for 50 cents an hour to do the same job. So you see the incentive of the contractors was to hire blacks. Now, if the white workers could force the black wages closer to $3, then it would be reduced incentive for contractors to hire black workers.
You know, Dr. Williams, you surely faced discrimination at various points in your life, but you are one of the most positive, and it's one of the reasons I want to have you on. You're one of those positive, inspiring people, and you just want to listen. And I think this is why millions of people, when they hear you on the radio, maybe filling in for Rush or something, they just love you. But how did you avoid bitterness? Like, why did you stay so positive, even when you probably had to face issues that as a white kid that I didn't have to face growing up? How did you stay so positive?
I don't know. I think I think that one of the things that's different about our country that was not around today, and not around in yesteryear, is that people were concerned about. People today are concerned about people's self-esteem. They're concerned about not hurting anyone's feelings by telling them the truth. They want like if they've had handicaps, they want special privileges or special help. Now, when I was a youngster, my mother used to tell me, look, Walter, there is discrimination. There's racial discrimination. And you know what that means? It means that you have to be better. You have to try harder. And that's the kind of lessons I got. Or with my stepfather, he would say, look, if you want to make it in this world, you have to learn to come early and stay late. And so those were the kind of values that I grew up with, and being bitter about something doesn't help out at all. I mean, that is the way you get even, if you're concerned with getting even, is to work hard and accomplish more. And today, that is not quite the attitude. People think, well, there should be some kind of compensation for slavery. There should be some kind of consideration for years of injustice that black people suffered, and this kind of thing, taken into consideration. The discrimination and handicaps that blacks have had has been devastating. That is where professors in colleges, black students are admitted to colleges on much lower standards than white students. Sometimes when they're in college, professors give them a break, give them a C or give them a B when they should get an F in the class, and those kind of things. That kind of treatment does not help, and so. So anyway, I just don't share the philosophy that many people share today, both black and white, I might add.
You know, some in the audience might be thinking, well, you know, you sound like part of the establishment. Other people have had a harder time. But if I look back at some of, in preparing to speak with you today, you had a fondness more for Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King. So you were willing to fight even more.
Oh yes, and I might say that a black person living today, he has not seen things that I've seen, things like signs posted, colored waiting room, colored water fountain, colored entrance. And he has not seen any lynching and all these horrible things that's part of our history. And matter of fact, the average poor black person, or the average poor American in general, you have statistics like 60-some% of them own at least one car. That the people that the Census Department defines as poor, 60-some% of them own at least one car, and 14% two or more cars. Poor people have 90-some% of poor people have microwaves. They have a large number have cable TVs. The average poor person has more living space to live in than middle class people in Europe and other parts of the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia. And so poverty today is, and there's no poverty in the United States. That is, there's no material poverty in the United States, because poor people are much better off than they were in the 40s and 50s. Now, what we do have is spiritual poverty of the spirit, where people have adopted certain kinds of pathological lifestyles, dependency, crime, illegitimacy, family breakdown. And these are devastating things, but it's no more material poverty, and not the kind of material poverty that I saw. For example, my wife, she was the youngest of 11 children. And her father, we're both young. I'm 78, and my wife, if she were still alive, she'd be 81. But her father used to have to move his family into abandoned buildings and maybe jury-rig the electricity so they can have some light and maybe some heat. Now, you don't find that kind of stuff going on today in the United States.
Yeah, speaking of jerry-rigging, I can walk out my door here in Saigon and I can see the jerry-rigging of the wires just about everywhere.
Yeah, right.
It's quite different. Hey, let me shift into a bigger picture issue. So how did you feel as an economist, free market mindset, in the fall of 2008 when the Fed, government officials decided to let Bear Stearns go under, let Lehman Brothers go under, but then they saved Goldman Sachs. They saved Morgan Stanley. And I think, sometimes people on the right want to always say about critics of, they want to criticize the left. They say, hey, we want to do away with welfare. But you know what? I have a big problem with Goldman Sachs welfare. I have a big problem with Morgan Stanley welfare. And I think sometimes that gets glossed over. How did you feel when you realized we were bailing out speculative ventures in the fall of 2008? It wasn't a good thing, was it?
Well, no, it was not. I think that if you want to find the question why Goldman Sachs, the big financial firms were bailed out, you look at who was the ex-Secretary of Treasury and the kind of impact they had in Washington, and that's why they got bailed out. But I think that what bailing out does, it conceals a lot of the foolhardiness of previous administrations, namely the Bush administration, with the idea that everybody should be a homeowner, and they were keeping interest rates artificially low. And when you keep interest rates artificially low, it gives people incentives to invest when they should not invest in buying a house and in buying a business. And there's a comeuppance to it, and that comeuppance came in 2007, 2008, when people began to question the worthiness of all this debt that had been created, and in the housing market was devastating. That is, they were making liar loans. That is, banks were knowingly giving mortgages to people who could not afford it. But what the hell did the bank care? Because Fannie Mae and Ginnie Mae and the Federal Reserve was buying the paper, and so it just got them off it gets everybody off the hook. And you're absolutely right that handouts to wealthy people is just as bad as handouts to poor people. There's no justification for either.
Yeah, I agree completely. Big picture, to me, if I look at my home country, I don't know if I see left and right anymore. I sort of see one group of people that wants the state to take care of a lot of things, and the other group just says, state, go away. And I don't know what the percentages are. To me, it feels like the numbers and percentages of people that want the state to step in and handle everything just seems to be growing. And I think the issue that troubles me is, like, how did people come to have this much respect for bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.? I mean, you and I know, for example, how much wealth has been created in the Northern Virginia area in real estate. And it's not the result of free market economics. It's the result of government employees that get guaranteed salaries, and they make a ton of money and they jack these prices up. But how do we get to this point where people want to trust the state so much? What triggered? What went wrong?
Well, it's fairly difficult for me to put my finger on any one source, but I think that if you had to tie down to a bedrock cause, I would say it's a result of a generalized contempt and disrespect for the United States Constitution. That is, what the average American wants Congress to do things that for which there's no constitutional authority for Congress to do. For example, to give you an idea, James Madison is the acknowledged father of the Constitution. So you kind of guess that James Madison would know what's in the Constitution. And in 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. And James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, and these quotes are on my website, walterewilliams.com. James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to spend the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence. Now, if you look at the federal budget today, 2/3 through 3/4 of it is for the purposes of benevolence. Madison also said that charity is not a legitimate function of government. Now, you take a politician today running for office, wanting to be the president of the country, like James Madison, and if he said during his campaign that charity is not a legitimate function of government, if he said that what James Madison said, he can't find anything in the Constitution to authorize spending for the purpose of benevolence, that person would never be elected to office by the American people. The American people would have just contempt for an idea that government should not be in the business of helping, should not be in business of giving one person's earnings to another person. And any senator running for office, or a congressman saying the same thing, he'd be run out of town on a rail. That is, if I were the senator running for the Senate in any state, conservative or liberal state, and say Virginia, and I'm running for the Senate in Virginia, and I go back and forth across the country, and I say, look, my fellow Virginians, I've read the United States Constitution, and I'm going to respect the Constitution. So if you elect me to office, don't expect for me to bring back highway construction funds, aid to higher education, Medicare, et cetera, et cetera. I would not get elected to office by the citizens of Virginia. The tragedy is that Virginians would be acting exactly right by not electing me to office, but they elected me to the Senate. Why? Because if I don't bring back billions and billions of dollars for the citizens of Virginia, that doesn't mean that Virginians will pay a lower federal income tax. All that it means is that Maryland will get it instead. That is, once legalized theft begins, it pays for everybody to participate in it, and those who do not participate in it are going to wind up as losers because they will not benefit. There's no benefit whatsoever except moral satisfaction, but there's no financial, economic benefit from people not participating in the handout game, and that's the tragedy of it.
Yeah, and I don't see how that shifts anytime soon. I think
and so what I'm saying, if you're expecting for it to shift, look, I've asked people, I say, is there any difference? Is there any basic human difference between Americans and Romans, the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, and the English? These are great empires of the past, but they went down the tubes for precisely what we're doing. And so is there anything to exempt us from what happened to these other great nations of the past? And I reluctantly observe no, because we have lost our love in our nation. We've lost our love for liberty. And the true tragedy of liberty failing in the United States, because if liberty is lost in the United States, I believe that it will be lost all times and all places forever.
Something strong for people to think about. I think it's, I share your view. I think you've made a strong case for it. Hey, I have one quick question, just kind of a personal thing. So as a guy who calls himself a radical, a man who stands on stage and has no problem taking the slings and arrows, how have you developed the thick skin to deal with criticism? There's a lot of people out there that they don't want to stand up. They're afraid of what their friends are going to say. They're afraid of what their family is going to say. They don't want to stand outside the crowd. Walter Williams clearly has no problem being outside the crowd. So how did you learn this ability to not let criticism eat you up?
Well, it doesn't bother me. Matter of fact, a lot of criticism I find very helpful. Because criticism is the way to learn. Criticism is a way to learn, maybe to explain your message in another way. And then on top of it, I have a rich physical endowment. I'm 6'5", so people have to think twice before. That makes you less subject to intimidation. And then it's no longer applicable today. But when I was in the Army, I had a lot of problems in the Army. I was stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia, and one time an officer told me, Williams, with all these things you're doing, you're going to get in trouble. And so I said, what kind of trouble can you possibly get me in? Are you going to paint me black and send me to Georgia? I'm already in trouble.
Hey, you say 6'5", but I noticed somewhere that you recently found out in the last bunch of years that your second cousin was Dr. J. So he had a few more inches on you, huh?
Oh, yes, he did. Yeah. Yes, he did. Yes.
Hey, Dr. Williams, where is the best place that the audience can go to find out more information about you?
Well, they can go to my website. It's walterewilliams.com. walterewilliams.com. And then also, what I will send to you, if you don't let me forget, there's the Free to Choose people. These are the people who made the Milton Friedman's series, Free to Choose. They've made a documentary on my life. They'll be coming out in the fall. And so what I'll do is I'll try to and as a matter of fact, the title of the documentary is called Suffer No Fools. And what I'll try to do is to send you a preview of it.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The Free to Choose has sent out, I think, is like a 6-minute preview.
That'd be great. Maybe we can circle back on a follow-up conversation when it comes out, perhaps. But
yeah, right. And then it has also has a place where you can be notified when when it's going to be aired and other particulars.
It's tough to hang up with you. I got to go, but I tell you, because I can't keep you all day. But I could sit here for hours and pick your brain. I'm sure your students feel the same way sometimes. But hey, listen, I appreciate you giving my audience all your great insights, and hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me.
My guest today is Walter Williams, professor, economist, commentator, academic. He is the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University, which happens to be my alma mater. This is Professor Williams' second appearance on this podcast. It's been several years in between episodes. This podcast has so many different guests on, but recently I said to myself, my gosh, it's time to have Professor Williams back on. He is so clear-minded, so practical, and he's 83 years young. He only gave me a brief window today, but I will take that brief time any day of the week. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Walter Williams. So, Professor Williams, in advance of this call, I was thinking all the rage right now in the media coverage is this young lady who's in Congress, AOC. She's like 29 years old, and she's talking socialism. And many young people really like what she's saying. I would love for you to take your best stab. Let's assume many of these people are good-intentioned. They just don't know what you know. Where would you start with young people that are embracing this young lady's position in Congress, this socialism position? Where would you start with young people to persuade them that maybe this is not such a good idea?
I think that many people think that socialism is the same thing that we see in Scandinavian countries. They say, well, gee, Sweden is a socialist country and everything's fine there. But it turns out that probably you would not want to call Sweden a socialist country. It experimented with socialism for about 20 years, but it went back to a market system. Now they have a huge welfare system that might be characterized as socialism, but from the productive part of Sweden, it is not socialism. And matter of fact, Sweden has a number of characteristics that socialists would find offensive, such as no minimum wage law. They have educational vouchers. They have very, very reduced regulations. And this would not sit well with the socialists in the United States Congress. And then I'd also point out that if you went around the world and you wanted to identify the most evil in the world history, it would be attached to socialism, such as the Soviet Union was a socialist country. As a matter of fact, it's part of their name. The Nazis were the National Socialist Workers' Party. The Chinese under Mao Zedong were socialists. And if you look at the death toll of just those three socialist countries, you'd have to be talking about the murder of well over 100 million of their own citizens. And one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that what the Soviet Union did to people and what the Chinese did to people makes Hitler look like a piker in terms of the loss of life. He's accused of murdering 16 million people, but Stalin is 35 million, and Mao Zedong, any number around 50 million. Socialism doesn't have a very good track record, and if we even look at closer to home, such as Venezuela or Cuba, it does not have a very good track record there either.
How would you phrase, though, to these young people that are embracing her? And I want to think that she doesn't have the intentions of some of the awful nation states that you just mentioned, But what is the desire for her message? Like, what do people think they're going to get with her message?
I think that they think that they're going to get free goods. They're going to have the right to live at the expense of other people. And that is one great moral failure of our country in general. That is, the average person believes that it is okay for the United States Congress to forcibly use one American to serve the purposes of another American. Whether you're talking about farm subsidy programs, business bailouts, welfare, and roughly three-quarters of what Congress spends money on can be described as Congress forcibly taking the earnings of one American and giving them to another to whom it does not belong. I think that the young people who support socialism, they just want more of that. They want their tuitions completely paid for. They want their medical care completely paid for. And you hear people talk about free this or free that. There's nothing in this world is free. It might have a zero price, but it's going to cost somebody something.
I tend to think that most Americans, well, this is, as I start to say that, but I think people are generally intelligent, but I just wonder sometimes with these desires to take from others, people are not being responsible to think about the natural consequences of doing that behavior over a long enough period of time. Eventually, what's left?
It's totalitarianism. That is what socialism tries to do. It tries to change human nature. Human nature is such that we all want more for ourselves. We all tend to believe that what we produce belongs to us. Now, when you talk about socialism, you're talking about trying to change human nature, and you're talking about doing some very bizarre things. I mean, take the socialist members of Congress, or you take a socialist young people, and you say, well, look, you ask them the following question. Suppose somebody like Walter Williams agrees to pay his share of the constitutionally mandated functions of the federal government that are enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. But he will not have his earnings going to farmers, going to bail out people, and going to food stamps. And so he just does not pay that amount of money to the IRS. Well, then what would happen? What would the average person say? Well, if he does that, well, the IRS should fine him for not paying all of his taxes. Well, I suppose you say, well, Walter Williams is not going to pay the fine because it's just plain not right. And then they'll say, okay, well, you should take his house. And I say, well, that's my house. And they'll send armed agents to take my house, and I'll be armed trying to defend my house, and they'll kill me. If you disagree with what the socialists call for, namely the redistribution of income, if you disagree wholeheartedly and act upon the disagreement, the ultimate end is death.
Professor, I have to ask a personal question at this moment before I jump back into some of these really big picture issues. What has made you such a clear thinker? How did you develop this clear thinking where, I love listening to you. I know other people love listening, but what has enabled you to find this voice of clear thinking?
I wasn't born with it, and I did not always have it. And if you say, well, do your best to identify where you got clear thinking, I got it from being 83 years old, and I got most of my education before people started worrying about student self-esteem, and they didn't mind telling me I was damn wrong. Also, I got virtually all of my education before it became fashionable for white people to like black people. When I got a C, it was an honest-to-God C in class. When I got an A, it was honest-to-God A. Nobody's feeling sorry for me, and they read me the riot act when I was wrong.
Is there one particular person, excluding family? I know your mom was very important in your life, but excluding family, was there a particular person or reading a book that really started you down your path?
I think that a lot of it happened in graduate school at UCLA. At UCLA, they just didn't play games with students. Matter of fact, when I took the PhD theory exam, 16 students took it, 14 flunked. and I was among the ones that flunked. And they called me to the office. They called students who flunked to their office to decide whether they should be allowed to continue in the program. And one of the professors told me in this committee of three people, Walter, your exam was among the worst, but we think that you can do better. And so they gave me all kinds of reading lists, and I was supposed to meet with them to go over the articles. And sometime I left their office feeling like 2 cents, and then the other times I felt like $1 million because I had gotten it right. The point is that my professors, particularly at UCLA, they were very humane. That is, they gave me help in the most constructive form of it. And I often tell people that had I gone to Harvard or Yale or Berkeley, one of these more leftist schools, they would have felt sorry for me and they would have passed me, and I would not be as good an economist as I am now.
And if you were coming along today, you might have made a different choice. You might have gone to one of the more left-leaning universities.
Oh, yes, that's absolutely right. And I kind of stumbled into UCLA by a series of mistakes.
Let me lay something out for you that I've been thinking about recently. I'm really wondering about the politics of America, and I'm wondering, and I'm really curious your view, will America ever cease its debate about race, gender, and religion? Or is this going to be the forever for America? Of course, you and I cannot predict what will happen past our lifetimes, but it sure looks like this trend, there's too much power to have these hot potatoes, these hot coals out there in the hands of politicians. And a certain number of voters love these issues. It just seems like these are going to be issues that America is arguing about forever, never to stop.
It surely appears that way. In the case of race, I think that racial discrimination in our country could have earned a well-deserved death. But there have been so many people around who profit from giving it life because it means more power and more control to them from either the financial point of view or from the political point of view. And the same thing is happening with sex. People benefit from saying, well, gee, women are discriminated against. They only make the 70% of the income that men make, and all kinds of rhetoric like that, and that empowers feminists. So I think that these are issues, race, sex, and religion, are issues that provide a lot of fodder for people's hidden agendas.
Let me take you back to my AOC example. Let me just pretend that you're on the subway somewhere in America. You're taking the train, sitting next to a young person, and the conversation comes up. And the young person starts to ask about you, your experiences, your career. And invariably, you end up mentioning liberty. And that young person says to you, well, Professor Williams, I don't know about liberty. And, you smile. What do you say next? I think even intelligent people in America don't think about the concept of liberty enough. And that's really all we've got as Americans. And when that's gone, there's no more America, is there?
No, that's right. I think that when you look at the issue of liberty, you have to kind of step back a few steps. I tell people my initial assumption is that I own Walter Williams. I am the property of Walter Williams. And you are your property. Now, once you establish the idea of self-ownership, then certain acts are moral and certain acts are immoral. That is, the reason why rape is immoral is because it violates private property. Murder violates private property. Theft violates private property. And so you can say that, well, gee, liberty is kind of a fuzzy concept in and of itself. But as I said, if you make the assumption that we each own ourselves, then certain acts are moral and certain acts are immoral. So we might call that liberty. That is, when people are not violating others' private property by stealing from them, from raping them and murdering them and interfering with them. You can call that liberty. But really, what it is, it's acknowledging private property. And I'd also tell the person that I think that helping one's fellow man in need is very, very important. And I think that helping one's fellow man in need by reaching into one's own pockets to do so is praiseworthy and laudable. Helping one's fellow man in need by reaching into somebody else's pockets to do so is worthy of condemnation. And I would remind the Christians among us that when God gave Moses the commandment, thou shalt not steal, he did not mean thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in the United States Congress.
That's the trick right there, huh?
That's right.
That's what people don't want to accept. Let me shift you to an issue that has really bothered me in the last couple of years. You know, the town square in America has shifted. It's really not the town square anymore. The town square in America is now all of these social media platforms. And these social media platforms are private operations. And that's great. I mean, I salute the people that invented these concerns. I'm curious your opinion, though, because it sure looks like to me that many of these social media concerns have monopoly power, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I am seeing today a certain amount of censorship, so to speak, private censorship. And I would have to say that myself, as an individual who's been online and had a voice, I don't feel comfortable saying everything I might want to say in this day and age. It seems like we are being restricted, even if it's not a government restriction. How do you feel about the issue of free speech today and some of the trends that are underway?
I think that there's increasing contempt among the American people for the principles of free speech. I think that people do not realize that the true test of one's commitment to free speech does not come when you allow people to be free to say those things with which you agree. The true test of one's commitment to free speech comes when you permit people to say those things that you find utterly offensive. And it's the same principle with respect to freedom of association. The true test of one's commitment to freedom of association does not come when we permit people to be free to associate in ways that we find acceptable. It comes when we allow people to associate in ways that we find offensive, such as, for example, if a club did not want to grant me membership because I'm a Black American, well, I find that offensive, but I think that that person has the right to do so. And so far as social media restricting free speech or censoring things, well, if it's privately owned, well, that's their right to do what they want to do. And what I would just urge is that there not be any restrictions on competition, that is, for others to enter to be able to compete with the various social media who think that it's their right to censor people.
Well, that's the tricky part there again as well, is that we kind of don't know as outside observers. We really don't know the power that social media concerns are exhibiting in the halls of Congress. Because we all know, for example, there has been no search engine competition for Google for over a decade. There's no known competition for Facebook. Twitter does its own thing. It doesn't seem like competition is lining up.
So long as it's private, it's not subsidized by government, and potential competitors are not restricted for entry, then I say, well, we just live with it.
It's up to the individuals to create the competition and not just complain about, I don't have my free speech on Facebook or something like that.
That is right. There are many things that I find offensive that I live with. I mean, I don't like the way certain people dress or their language or the fact that they like beer, but I'm not going to restrict them from doing things that I find offensive.
You've mentioned being a Black man in America, and I've seen the phrase associated with you, one-party people in a two-party system. I've also seen some comments that you have made about Kanye West supporting the current president. Are we going to ever see a situation where more African-American, more Black people in America will say, gosh, I kind of like Walter Williams' pragmatic view. This makes a lot of sense to me. And if I'm going to support this one particular party, maybe I should get something more back for it. Maybe I'm not getting enough back for my support of that one party.
I think there's a movement towards that. But back in the 1970s, I have a very good friend and longtime colleague, Thomas Sowell. And we've been friends for over 50 years. And back in the early 70s, he said to me, Walter, if we're going to play pinochle, I have a pinochle game among conservative blacks, it would have to be cutthroat because it wouldn't be enough for it to have a partner. But however, that's no longer true. There's an increasing number of blacks that are questioning the conventional wisdom about blacks, and they're increasing number, like such as Kanye West and many others. They're questioning the ideas that have become monopolized in terms of black thinking. That is, they're questioning what the NAACP says, what these various congressmen say, and what these civil rights leaders say. They're beginning to question it. And I think that maybe 40 years from now, black Americans may be the most conservative people in the United States. The reason why is that blacks may come to realize that they've been victimized the most by liberal ideas. The welfare state has done to black Americans what slavery could not have done, the Jim Crow and the harshest racism could not have done, and that's destroyed the black family. That is, the black family is a mere shadow of what it was historically. And a lot of people don't realize that even in the late 1870s, black families were not that different in terms of composition, mother and father, as families of other ethnic groups. Even during slavery, more black kids lived in biological mother and father households than live today. And so I think that black people realize that they've been sold a bill of goods by liberals in our country.
I want to quote one of your heroes going back in time, Thomas Paine. He who dares not to offend cannot be honest. And I'm sure in your last few minutes right there, I'm sure someone listening will be offended. But then they have to really think, hold on, was he speaking the truth? That becomes the issue. People can be offended, but is Walter Williams speaking the truth?
Sometimes when people are offended, they automatically assume that the person cannot be speaking the truth.
I've only got a few more minutes with you, but going back in time, I know it was a big influence on you, and I just mentioned Thomas Paine. Would you care to give my audience kind of a brief synopsis about why his work, Common Sense, was so important to you as a young man?
I've read Common Sense on any number of times, and what Common Sense represented, Thomas Paine was a pamphleteer. He was trying to get the American people to rebel against the king, to rebel against unjust acts by the King of England. And he said very, very wise things about the need for government, but at the same time keeping it very, very small. But I'd also say that the Federalist Papers, I cannot think of a set of documents that were more brilliant in American history than the Federalist Papers making the case for ratification of the United States Constitution and making the case that government was going to be very, very small. Matter of fact, if you read Federalist Paper 45, which was written by James Madison, the acknowledged father of the Constitution, you realize how far we have traveled from the vision that was around for us in 1787. And in Federalist Paper 45, James Madison was trying to explain the Constitution to the citizens of New York and others and why it should be ratified. And he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, he says that the powers that we've delegated to the federal government are few and well-defined and restricted mostly to external affairs. Those left with the people and the states are indefinite and numerous. Now, if you turn that upside down, you would have what we have today, that the powers of the federal government are indefinite and numerous, and those of the people in the states are restricted. And you would see at the same time the gross betrayal that Americans have made to the founding fathers of our country.
As I listen to you, and it's always so nice to hear such a clear view, very pragmatic, but it's also an alarming time because it sure looks like the trends that are underway in our country they don't look like good trends. I want to keep my fingers crossed and hope for the best, but it sure looks like that sometime well off in the future, maybe after we both leave the planet, that things might unravel.
If they did, it would be natural for them to unravel. That is, if you look at mankind's history, most of mankind's history, he has been subject to arbitrary abuse and control by others. I'm sure that a historian writing 200 years from now he'll say, well, yes, mankind had this history of arbitrary abuse and controls by others, but there was this one tiny historical curiosity where people had a relatively large amounts of personal liberty, and it was mostly in Western Europe and in the United States. But it all went back to the normal state of affairs, arbitrary abuse and control by others. And I think that if you ask the question, and we recognize that our nation is not a totalitarian nation yet, but if you ask the question, which way are we headed, tiny steps at a time? Are we headed towards more personal liberty, or are we headed towards more government control over our lives? It would have to be unambiguously the latter, more government control over our lives. So I'm suggesting that personal liberty is not a politically stable set of affairs, and it will always degenerate into totalitarianism or some form of restrictions of personal liberty.
People can use their liberty to destroy liberty, can't they?
That is absolutely right.
Professor, I appreciate you taking the time today. Hey, is there any place we can send people to? You're easily found everywhere on the internet, but is there a particular website or any place you'd like to direct people to?
My webpage is walterewilliams.com. And it has all of my publications and a bunch of videos, and it has my life there.
Sir, I appreciate you taking the time today. It's always nice to speak to you. As a George Mason alum, you were helped to push me along to having so many Mason economists on this show, from Vernon Smith to Dan Klein to Peter Boettke, Peter Leeson, Tyler Cohen, Robin Hanson, Brian Kaplan, and yourself. I appreciate you taking the time.
They're great colleagues.
Yeah, great stuff. I thank you, sir.
Okay, bye.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.